In this video, we're going to talk about arguments and parameters. And what they're basically used for is to get information into a function or a method. Now, let's talk about this kind of abstractly first. So, picture these two circles as the main method and a function named method. So, the method is called function name. So in the main method, we have a variable, because remember we talk about variables being a box. And inside of it, we're going to put the value integer of 8, okay? Now, what happens is, this is going to be the argument inside of our function call. And when we actually have the function definition of function name, we're going to set up a parameter, which is basically setting up a variable, and it's going to be a temporary variable, and we're going to call it para1, which is parameter 1. And what happens is, any time that the function is called, the argument 1, so arg1, is going to be basically put into the parameter 1. So the value of 8, of an integer 8, is going to be put inside of para1, so the parameter of it. So inside of our function name, we can actually utilize that value just by copying it into a new variable, kind of a local variable. So let's look at that in code form. In code form, you can actually see that when we have our function call, which is the top one right there, we put our arguments inside of the parameters, and they're separated by commas, and that's extremely important. So inside of our function call, we have our arguments separated by commas. That's the important part. Now, when we actually have our function definition, when we set up our function, inside of our open and closing parentheses inside of there, we have our parameters, and we also separate them by commas. The only difference is the parameters, we actually have to give a data type to as well. So if they're integers, we have to put int. If they're strings, we have to put strings, and so on. I'm going to stay inside of my return functions solution, just because I want to show you the difference of what we can actually do with this. Now, if we look at the function that we created for calc area, we declare our width and height inside of the function itself, and then we calculate the area, and then we return the area up until the main method. The problem with this is it makes our method extremely inflexible, because it goes from a method that could calculate the area of any rectangle to specifically only it can calculate the area of a rectangle with a width of 6 and a height of 7, which is extremely specific. And the whole kind of purpose of creating a function is to increase flexibility of our code. So really what we should do is we should create these variables inside of our main method and then send them into our calc area as arguments and parameters. So let's see what this actually looks like. What we're going to do is we're going to take this and we are going to go into our main method, and we're going to first create above our function calls, we're going to create the variables for width and height. So I'm going to make them integers again. So int, I'm going to call this one width1, just so we can clearly show a difference between the width1 and width. But again, I probably would just call them width. So equals, let's make this one, doesn't really matter, 10. And int height1, and I'm going to make that equal to 5. So I'm creating variables that I'm going to send into our actual method itself. So what's going to happen first is I'm going to have to set up actual variables to receive them. And these variables I'm going to set up are the parameters. So I'm going to go into my function definition, so that's this right here, of my calc area, and inside of my parentheses, and I'm actually going to set the parameters inside of here. So the first one I'm going to set up is int, and I'm just going to call this one w. And usually what we do is for parameters, we usually make it a shortened version of the actual name that's coming into it. So width becomes W. Height will become H. Could they be the same name? Absolutely. Could they be something off the wall? Absolutely. But they should make sense to you, and they should be fairly descriptive as much as possible while still being fairly short. And we're going to separate these by commas. So I did int, which is the data type, w, which is going to be the name, comma, int, which is the data type, and h, which is going to be the name of the parameters. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to comment out the int width equals 6, and I'm going to comment out just by putting 2 slashes in front of the height as well. And with those commented out, this area doesn't really make sense anymore. And I want you to keep it in your notes. So I'm going to comment that out, and I'm just going to go to the next line and recreate it. So I'm going to go int again, area equals, and this time I'm just going to use w, which is going to be the parameter, because once I declare it up here, it becomes a local variable of sorts, and we can use it in our code below. But just like the other variables that we create inside of the method, it's only available inside of the actual code block itself. So I'm going to start with w times, oops, that was kind of weird, it auto-completed, w, there we go, times h, which is going to be the other parameter from above, and then do the semicolon. Now, if I try to run it right now, it's going to be a little bit wonky and it's going to give us an error because when we set up or defined this function, we're saying, hey, I need 2 things to run, and I need these 2 items. I need a width and a height. Now, when we function called this from above in our main method, we put in no arguments. So the actual error is there's no arguments given that corresponds to the required formal parameters of w. But we actually need 2 arguments because the arguments have to match the order of this. So what that means is whatever argument I put in here first eventually becomes the w variable, and whatever argument I put second becomes the h variable. So inside of my function call, I'm going to put width 1 and then a comma because these have to be separated by commas, and then height 1. Now when I run it, it'll give us 50 because that's 10 times 5, which is 50, right? So let's see what's actually happening here, kind of break it down. So sequentially, it comes to the top of this, and it declares the variable width 1 and sets the value to 10. It declares the variable of height 1 and sets the value to 5. Now, inside of line number 17, it's calling the calc area method, and it's passing along the width 1 variable and the height 1 variable. So what happens is the width 1 variable comes down here to line number 24, and it becomes the w variable. So just kind of like the graphic before, the value of width 1 is now stored in the value of w. Height 1 is now stored in the value of h. And then the code block starts to execute inside of our method. So the only real thing that it's going to execute is on line number 34, where it's going to take those 2 variables, multiply them together, store that value inside of area, and then return the value area. Now we covered returns before, but basically line number 38 makes this whole function call the value of area, which gets stored in the variable results, which then we can console.writeline it out. And that's the basics of arguments and parameters. The main thing you have to know is you want to mainly create all variables inside of your main method and then keep the actual methods that we create much more flexible. Now, why this is important is if I come up here and I call the function again, and I'm going to store the results in a variable called results2 equals calc area, open close, and a semicolon, I can put any integers inside of here as the arguments as well. So I don't always need variables. I can actually use numbers or integers themselves. For example, what if I throw in a 3, 4? Then I'm going to actually just console.writeline the results2 variable out, so you can see what I get. And when I run it, we get 12. So what happens is, the first part happens, so I won't explain that up to line number 19. But line number 22 gets interesting because once it executes the calc area method and stores the integer 3 inside of the variable w, the integer 4 inside of the variable h. Then it comes down here and calculates the area. So basically 3 times 4 is 12. It returns the number 12 to line number 22. So this whole function call right here that's highlighted becomes the integer 12 that is stored inside of results 2, and then you can actually right line it out. So what this has effectively done is to make our function calc area now able to calculate any area for any rectangle. So before, we only could do it for the width of 6 and height of 7 because we kind of hard-coded them into our actual code block of our method. But by passing them in, we can pass in any two values or two integers, and then we can get the area back. So this increases the flexibility, and it's the way arguments and parameters should be used inside of functions.